Nancy. Thanks all for coming here to hear Brooke Kroeger talk about her book, Undaunted, How Women Changed American Journalism, copies of which will be available for sale and signing after our conversation, your questions, comments. A special thanks to my former colleagues at Newsweek. The uneven progress of women in the workforce couldn't be a more timely topic this week, with the giving of a Nobel Prize for research in that area.
Hear, hear.
Ms. Kroeger is very much part of the dramatic transformation about which she writes. For more than a decade at home and abroad, she was a correspondent, editor, bureau chief, and division head for United Press International. She covered the United Nations from Newsday and was deputy metropolitan editor for the late lamented New York Newsday. At NYU later, Professor Kroeger was founding director of the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Her previous 5 books include a biography of Daredevil reporter Nellie Bly, about whom she'll say more shortly, and The Suffragettes, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote. That said, Ms. Kroeger, thanks again for joining us. Let's do it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Quinn. That was delightful.
About the time this book came out, the elevation of 2 female executives at CNN that women directed or co-directed every major U.S. news network. And we all see the profusion of women news and talk TV anchors, correspondents, print writers, columnists, editors. What's the latest estimate on the percentage of women throughout U.S. journalism today? And by comparison, roughly what portion are at the very top of mastheads and platforms around the country?
I can't give you a percentage, but I can tell you that they are preponderant and prevalent. And for me, having done this work from 1840 to the present, I live with this abiding fear that this is not a good thing. Because what you see over history is that when women have risen, it's usually in an organization or an institution or a situation that is about to fall apart. And I think we see a lot of that today in the state of newspapers, broadcast media, and other traditional forms of news delivery. And you know, when I see that, there was like, I wondered before the CNN story, and also Kristen Welker, you know, starting Meet the Press, that all the anchors of all the major news programs were women. And there was, I don't remember where I read it, but there was a grid of 9 or 12 women, either as CEOs or chief editors of the major institutions. And it just gives me terrible pause, because historically what you find is that, say in the 1930s, when it would be so unusual for a woman to become city editor, it actually happened. A year later, the publication would fail. Or when Marianne Dolan at 32 became chief editor of the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, extraordinary. I mean, that was a paper of 300,000 plus circulation. Within 5 years, the paper was gone. This seems to happen over and over again. So it also follows a sociological theory. It's called job cues, gender cues, that came out about, I think, 20 years ago or so. And what you see in fields is when alpha males, white men, flee and no longer want to do that work, women get their chance to rise, and other disproportionately disadvantaged groups in their wake. And that's kind of been the pattern historically. No one can always hope that this might signal a change, but I don't think the signs say that.
Which would you say is women's greater contribution to American journalism over the decades? Is it powerfully demonstrating that they could do the jobs as well as men, or in many cases even better, essentially embodying the concept of equality? Or is it adding a unique perspective that makes journalism better, broader, more engaged, more engaging?
So the answer to that is definitely both. First, because you have to understand that the history of women, let's start in 1840 when mass media starts. It's considered, begins with the New York Herald, New York Tribune, Horace Greeley running this big mass newspaper. that at that time, in 1840, when Margaret Fuller came to the fore as this complete phenomenon, I mean, a complete phenomenon. She was a genius. She had the respect of everyone. By 1840, she had done everything in journalism that, by 1850, let's say, that any person would want to do. And so the book is really about those women. It's about women who were A+++, women who never suffered from the things that the mass of women, and I'm talking about the A women, or the even A+ women, had to confront. And this goes back to the understanding of what women's sphere was, what women's role was, church, family, home, husband. These were cherished ideals that even women cherished. And so it became very hard for them to move out of the understanding that that's who they were and that's all they were destined to be. There was also a really strong feeling that women were congenitally unable to do the kind of high-level work that was being done in journalism at the top of the profession. So the way the mass of the women made their way into the profession was through the advent of the women's pages, which started around 1850. Why? This was work no man wanted to do. Nobody wanted to cover society and flower shows and rubber raincoats. And at the same time, this was seen as an area of great financial benefit because department store ads, perfume ads, elixirs, all that sort of thing was coming into the field as advertising. So you needed women to do those things. So that's the first answer. The second answer is women actually have been responsible, if not for inventing, for furthering some of the important forms that have been a real benefit to the field, besides the women's pages, who I don't really write about very much. I do write about Charlotte Curtis because she turned the women's pages into a power nexus at the New York Times, and that was really saying something. And her predecessor in the 1940s, Eleanor Darnton, who was women's editor for about 4 years, the mother of John Darnton, etc. And she pushed the idea that women's news was general news, but did not get very far, and ultimately quit and founded a women's news service that also didn't get very far, but lived along for about 7 years. So I lost my train of thought there.
Well, what women added.
Oh, what women added. So women championed the interview. They were very good at interviewing and really helped to introduce that as a standard journalistic form. That was around the 1880s, 1890s. They simply were very good at it. In war reporting, the mass of women who didn't go to the front, though there were many who did, defying regulation to do so because it was against regulation in World War II and World War I that hadn't been established yet, but a few did it even then. But the mass of women who were sent overseas were sent to write about the civilian part of war, the humanitarian aspects. So they weren't the only ones. We have that from Ernie Pyle, and others, of course, men did it as well. But women were very good at that, but largely because they were pen-posted to do that work. So those are areas where women really have, I think, changed things.
Sad to say, war also was a factor in advancing gender equity in journalism, and not only by opening up the slots previously filled by men who went to service. Talk about the cadre of women who went to cover World War I, including Nellie Bly, who's most remembered for one-upping Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, doing it in 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes.
Go Nellie.
So talk a little bit about the actual war coverage.
Okay, well, let's start back. Women are covering wars from Margaret Fuller goes to cover the Italian Revolution in the 1840s, so let's not forget that. But by the 1890s, the Spanish-American War, etc., we had women covering it. And as near as I can figure, if you look at the authorized roster of accredited correspondents, the ratio for a long time was 10%. So we see the difference now since the 1990s, where the proportion of women is large. Notice how many women's bylines or women you see on television who are right there at the forefront. It's completely common now, and that's been true since, I would say, like the mid-1990s. But before that, women represented about 10% of the field, and 10% of the women who would show up overseas. Of the population of reporters would be women. So I can talk a little bit about Nellie because I know a whole lot about her. So she ends up in Austria in 1914. Does everybody know what was happening in August 1914 when she arrived? She was there because she was fleeing prosecution in the United States, not for her journalism, but because she was running her late husband's manufacturing company and got herself into several financial imbroglios that were not so great. You can read about them in the book. But, not this book, but the Nellie Bly book. But anyway, so she flees to Austria where she knows this gentleman named Oscar Bondi, who probably was financing her or something like that. Maybe she was selling him steel barrels. She invented the steel barrel just on the side. And she ends up caught up in the war. And of course, before long, when the U.S. enters the war, she becomes an enemy alien. Before that, she was the only woman to cover the Eastern Front. There's an extraordinary series of her articles, which are easy to find online, Nellie on the firing line. And then after that, when she becomes an enemy alien, she's at this point become very involved with the nobility in Austria. Like she's kind of gotten herself into local culture. And what can you write about for American audiences from enemy territory? She writes about widows and orphans, something she had a lot of feeling about because her father died when she was very young, and though her mother lived, Nellie, she was the third of a litter of 5, or 2 litters actually, her father's first marriage and then his second. She was the member of the family who really took care of everyone. So she did that. So that's a little Nellie. But then, in World War I, we had several novelists, Edith Wharton, Mary McGrory. Others were writing for the Saturday Evening Post and others, and doing some pretty interesting work themselves. But novelists rather than journalists, though there were also journalists.
World War II created more empty spots in journalism for women. By then, you report more than half of all newsroom employees. Plus, there was respect and renown for some at the front. Talk a little bit about Martha Gellhorn on D-Day and Marguerite Higgins at the Dachau concentration camp.
Okay, so just a plug to Jeanette Conant, whose biography of Marguerite Higgins is coming out like any day now.
Another Newsweek alum.
Oh, there you go. Marguerite Higgins was a trollop. I mean, she's just so interesting. Nothing got in her way. She starts, I have some wonderful stuff from Flora Lewis's oral history, where they were classmates at Columbia. And she tells a story that's so emblematic of Marguerite Higgins throughout the rest of her career, where they all get one assignment to do an op-ed piece or something like that. And Marguerite goes ahead of everyone to the library and checks out every relevant book and takes them all. And that's how she functioned through her journalism. But she was inordinately effective. And she is, with a reporter from Stars and Stripes, the first at Dachau. But later in her own memoir, she notes that, being first, journalists get credit for being a first. You were first there, or you were at Nuremberg, or you were at D-Day. But it's not enough to be first. And even though the Women's Press Association in New York honored her, she herself later understood that it wasn't enough just to be first, it was what you wrote. And so by the time she gets to Korea, where she is the only woman among 3,000 correspondents, despised by her Herald Tribune colleague, Homer Bigger, thank you. And I mean despised. He tries to run her out of Korea. She fights back. General MacArthur takes her on the plane and then brings her back and reinstates her. There's a great photograph in my book. I'm sure it's probably in Jeanette's too, where he seems to have his hand placed around her waist. It's like kind of startling. But anyway, she's just an amazing character and does extraordinary work from Korea. And wins the second Pulitzer Prize that ever went to a woman journalist. The first, in 1937, went to Anne O'Hare McCormick, who was another phenomenon, another of these A+++ ladies, who really didn't get her fabulous start until after 40, which is true of a lot of women in this field, not all, but a lot. And as the journalists in the room can tell you, this is a field where having legs is important, not shapely legs, but legs that run. And it's amazing how many women, at a time when 40, was not the new 30 or the new 20, were succeeding in their second acts. The book has quite a few of those stories. And they start really early. I mean, that was happening. Someone suggested to me, and maybe they were right, that part of that might have had to do with the desexualization, because women in the newsroom created some havoc, especially those who didn't know how to behave, sitting on desks with crossed legs and flirting with the copy boys, and a lot is said about that in the 1920s that worked against women for decades, women who didn't participate in that way. And looseness got in the way in the same way. Flora Lewis at a certain point says, it used to bother me. I thought we're all getting painted with that brush and it's negative for us. But the men behave like that. Why shouldn't the women? I think she might have been right.
You mentioned McCormick. She started freelance, but she was picked up by the Times. They didn't.
Oh, wait, stop. Freelance for the Times for 14 years while she is identifying Mussolini, while she is doing some of the most extraordinary diplomatic reporting next to Dorothy Thompson, who was doing as much. 14 years. It takes till Adolf Ochs dies, so his son-in-law, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, takes over, and good old Anne McCormick, like all these fantastic women, is a remarkable networker. She is very close to Iphigene, his wife. She is close to him. They are social friends. And not that that's why, but Arthur Hayes, she had his attention. He got her, he saw her. So he immediately makes her an op-ed columnist, puts her on the editorial board, the first woman in the history of the paper, and the Sulzberger Ochses had owned it since about 1890 something. So this is, 50 years on. And the next year she wins the Pulitzer Prize. I just want to say one more thing.
The Times didn't nominate her.
Don't give up the scoop. Okay. Yeah, the Times, the way she got nominated will surprise you and make you sad. But anyway, she does win the Pulitzer. And that's a scoop. That's a scoop. Nobody knew that.
The is that she was not nominated by the Times, but the jury, by acclamation, gave her the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, and the jury was
Times.
a bevy of professors from Columbia that year for some reason. It was only Columbia professors. And there was no packet. And the way this came out in doing the documentation, because I was looking for the 1936-37 packet, because every paper with a nomination sends articles and they send letters and, they really put together a nomination that's quite extensive. And there's just nothing. And then, so nothing in the Columbia Rare Books record, so I went to the Pulitzer Committee to see if I could find something else out. And what they sent me were the requests of the committee that was making an exhibition, in those flat vitrines of the Pulitzer Prizes of that year, and the committee is asking for the packet, and the jury writes back and says there is no packet, we use the Columbia newspapers, and she was awarded the prize straight out. So now you know. Yes.
I have to say, another thing that you confirm is what an old Newsweek hand who'd been in Korea when Margaret Higgins was there.
Who was that?
His name was Dwight Martin. He was working Life magazine and maybe the CIA.
Oh.
And the best thing about him is that his listing in Who's Who begins, Copy Boy, Washington Post. He was very nice to me. So you mentioned the enmity of Homer Biggert, who I must say had a stammer. And so you confirmed what Dwight said was Biggert's reaction when Margaret Higgins went home to have a baby.
That came from Betsy Wade. And he was a little remorseful of how poorly he had treated her. I mean, he really treated her badly. Plus, she was so the opposite of risk-averse. She would take risks that no one would take in a war front, forcing him to have to match the risks because he was competitive after all. Things he would never have done, he did because she was doing them. And so years later, he's asked which was true. Did he say, when he heard that she had had a baby, who's the mother, or did she eat it? And his answer was, yes.
That's what Dwight said. Was broadcasting, which made war so much more part of our daily lives, from Korea, Vietnam, later Iraq, Afghanistan, an easier or more difficult medium for women? And who do you see as among the most notable female groundbreakers behind the mic, in front of the camera, or behind it?
Oh gosh. I think I can speak to World War II, where women really had a raw deal, because women who were doing broadcasting for CBS, there are stories of some who the network requested that a man read their stories over the air, can you imagine, because women's voices were not considered authoritative enough. And then when, back in the States, the new groups were formed, Edward R. Murrow's groups, for example, he didn't include any of the women who had been used quite a lot during World War II. So that was pretty typical.
How important was it that journalism started moving from a trade or a craft to a profession populated by ever new generations of former college newspaper editors who were quite comfortable working with and for members of the opposite sex?
Oh, you know, I talk about that in terms of sports, where you see that when the college papers, when women were writing college sports, how that could change when it came to the locker room, because the first women down that pike really struggled. And of course there was Melissa Ludke's lawsuit against the Yankees that allowed women into the locker rooms for the first time. And that's, you know, considered a landmark. And then others like Leslie Visser, I talk about her quite a lot because I thought she was interesting. She said, you know, she didn't, how did she put it? She didn't, you know, she wasn't the first, but she made the breakfast, you know, something like that of women in sports, and yet it took a long, long time before a woman could call a Monday night football game on the air. Things like that took much, much longer. So that sort of thing happened. And then Pauline Frederick, I spend a lot of time on because she's kind of the forgotten hero of breaking into television for women. She covered the United Nations mostly, but also political conventions and things like that. She was a very high-end journalist, also someone who didn't get a break till she was in her 40s. And on television, imagine that. There's a great Gay Talese profile of her, kind of buried, that I dug out, where he spends a lot of time talking about her appearance. But appearance is a big issue on television, as we know. And then there was a wonderful article in one of the women's magazines where Connie Chung and Lynn Scher and Leslie Stahl are in their late 30s, and the lawsuit in Kansas City has happened with Christine Kraft, who was fired at 37 for being, not fired, but demoted from Anchor for being too old, too ugly, and not deferential enough to men, which she made the title of her book. And so there were groups of women that organized in New York to help financially with women who might have to file suits. And all of them are looking at each other thinking, they can't get rid of all of us at once. And Leslie Stahl says something like, I'm at the crest, I'm in my prime. And of course we see that she was right about that. So that's kind of a nice story.
Do you see some poetic justice in the connection between early female journalism, focusing a lot on inequality and injustice? Nellie Bly went undercover as a madwoman to see about the treatment of the mentally ill. Many later social reforms, including, as it happened, the equal employment opportunity laws that gave women at Newsweek leverage for the first time for more gender equity in journalism.
Well, I was really excited to be at a table with the pioneers of the Newsweek suit, so that is really exciting to me. The Newsweek suit was the first of about 10, and they happened, you know, like dominoes. New York Times, Detroit Free Press, Washington Post, Washington Star, Reader's Digest, Life, Look, Time. I'm probably missing a few, but there was just a slew of them. And as we were saying at the table, and I hope maybe somebody will comment, because that would be an honor for us, that the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. It took 6 more years, and Lynn Povich says this in her book, or maybe she said it to me, but 6 more years for women to realize that it applied to them. that they could use it as an instrument of change. 6 years. And remember, the Feminine Mystique had come out in '63. So that tells you about the mindset. Even after the revolution was in bloom, they just didn't even grasp that it applied to them because it seemed so related to race. But it was related to all forms of discrimination. So just even being able to internalize that took 6 years, that just leaves me stunned. And the results of these suits were slow going, incremental. I know Lynn said there were meetings after meetings after meetings, and the change was glacial. This was also true with the New York Times. Even with all the goodwill in the world and the willingness to have a third of the staff be women, it took forever. And finally, speaking about the Times, when they finally appoint women to be associate managing editors, assistant managing editors, AMEs, Carolyn Lee and Soma Golden Bear, a couple of years after Carolyn, which was, a great big deal and considered a huge victory. But when I asked Carolyn, did you see yourself as aspiring to the top job? And she said, it never crossed my mind. I didn't have that profile. She was an editor's editor, as Soma was. And so if you think about that, that's who got those positions, women who were never going to advance above them, because the Times track was Washington, overseas, Pulitzer Prize. I mean, that was the track to be an editor. It's not a lot different today. So I don't even know if they thought it. Soma said, I had diabetes, 2 children, and a husband who wasn't in a position to help very much, so I was at the limit of my capacity. Neither of them saw themselves as on track to lead.
At the Times, with many women already in senior positions, Washington bureau chief Jill Abramson next became managing editor, and in 2011 got the top spot, first female executive editor, only to lose it in 2014, at least in part over gender-related mismanagement, as I read it. Talk about that episode and the arc of her career.
Yeah, I think you have to read the chapter to make your own decision about what the reasons for that were. She was a brilliant journalist, had a brilliant career, had been in top managerial positions for at least, 12 or 15 years or longer, because she'd been an American Lawyer and the Wall Street Journal before that. So people had a lot of time to look at her management style. I mean, let's just say that. But she was extremely helpful to me. It's a very complete chapter, and it goes back through her career, so you can really make your own decision about what you see.
But she does something in regard to her number 2.
She
getting
did.
an additional number 2, and he was black, and he was presumed to be her heir,
Yeah.
and he went and complained, and he...
Yeah, it's more than that. I mean, yes, all those things are true. There had been double managing editors before him, and when he began as assistant managing editor, so when he became managing editor, there were 2, and then 1 retired. So if there was a precedent, she made the terrible mistake of not sharing with him what she was affecting, even though she had shared it with the publisher and the president, so they knew about it. But she hadn't shared it with her compatriot. She also had, in her own words, she had erred in helping buyouts to a lot of senior people when finances dictated the need, who were her best friends in the newsroom. So she lost a lot of support that way. And she had ceded to her managing editor the role of forming the team, the management team. So they were more loyal to him than to her. And she was controversial as she came in, and probably didn't do herself favors in some ways, and yet I think, I forget the number now, but in her 3 years there are at least 8 Pulitzers attributed to her that could be in her column. The performance of the paper was excellent, but she had a few people who weren't so happy with her.
So the Times had...
And Dean wanted that job.
The Times had its first woman executive editor, then its first non-white executive editor, but you call the chapter The More Things Change because
she was placed out, and
and who eventually then subsequently became
a white guy, yeah.
A white Jewish guy.
A white Jewish guy, yeah.
All right, I think we're getting close to time. I want one more question.
Who, by the way, was also brilliant. I mean, let's just say that.
Well, no other people existed at the time. Early in your book, it becomes clear there have been exceptional women in journalism for almost 2 centuries.
Yes.
The problem was they were mostly seen as exceptions, not indicators of what many of their gender could actually do.
Exactly.
So was it more the collective achievements of all those women and their like inside American journalism that changed it, or more those outside and birth control, prompting society at large to broaden its view of women's role in work and life generally, that brought journalism to a process of acceptance and change that is, one has to admit, still ongoing?
Still ongoing. I don't know how to answer that exactly, but I'm going to tell you a parable that's not in the book that happened when Barbara Walters died. And I did little with Barbara Walters because I spent more attention on Pauline Frederick, who was 15 years earlier, and I thought more important to my story. But when she died, NBC put up some, I don't know if this is on point, but it's such a good story, I'm going to tell it. Put up this video of her in 1963, or maybe it was late 62, I have to check that. I did write a post about it, which is easy to find if you put in Gloria Steinem, Barbara Walters, Playboy Bunny. And it's of her as a Playboy Bunny. And she doesn't go on the air until 65. She's working, as a news writer, I guess, at that point. But obviously ambitious, and, trying to make her way. So I pieced back the chronology. Chronology is so important. This book is totally chronological, so you can really, really see how things evolve. But the Playboy clubs had opened in New York in early December, and this piece runs December 29th, so that makes pretty good sense. They're in New York, and she poses as a Playboy bunny, and she looks pretty good in the costume, and she talks about the matron and what it takes to be a bunny and the application and how to do the bunny dip, which is how you serve a drink without showing all your goods, and et cetera, et cetera. And as she's leaving, the doorman says, "You're leaving early," and she goes, "I'm not leaving early. I'm not a bunny. I am a correspondent for the National Broadcasting Corporation." And then she's having banter with Hugh Downs about this piece that's running December 29th, I believe. And he several times comments on how good she looks in the costume, and she does give him the side eye. She does do that. But then she says, when the doorman said that to her, I couldn't help but be flattered. And it's just the kind of puff piece you would expect about the opening of the Playboy Club. Well, I knew from my work on undercover reporting a lot about Gloria Steinem's Playboy Bunny piece. And from looking at this, I realized that she's reporting it 6 weeks later in 64, so it's either 62, 63, or 63, 64, please don't hold me to it. But she's reporting it then in the same month, February, that The Feminine Mystique is published, so it's 63. And 3 months later, when it's published, because it's in Show magazine, so a magazine takes 4 months usually to get something into print in those days, is when the Equal Pay Act passes. So to me, this is like a moment, historically, just to speak to your point in a kind of oblique way, where the world changed. It's like 1910 when Virginia Woolf says, the world changed, modernism happened. And I think it's an inflection point for women at that point to see the difference in the kind of piece, the expose that Gloria Steinem did over against the piece that was reported maybe a month and a half earlier. I mean, it's a time of real change. So we do see that. Isn't that a good way to end?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we have time for a few questions. If there are any comments from the Newsweek ladies or anybody, please.
We really love you to say something. Can we bring you a mic?
I don't know what I would say.
Okay, well, then let us say thank you. And
Definitely thank you.
give you time to go outside and buy books and have them signed.